What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 8 final look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for this week's NFL slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, NFL Week 8. Let's take a look at the quarterback position. So, stud on the slate that I like, Jalen Hurts from the Philadelphia Eagles, playing the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have the 5th worst defense overall. They give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Jalen Hurts has averaged 25.6 fantasy points per game on the season, and I love this pick because he's getting an average of 12.8 rush attempts per game. So, monster rushing upside. He's going to be about 7% owned, projected at 23.4 fantasy points here in Week 8. He's 8,300 DraftKings salary, 900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game, with the Eagles favored by 10.5. So Jalen Hurts has scored 17, 28, and 17 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 9, 15, and 16 rush attempts in those games. So great matchup here. And this guy can just rack up those fantasy points from the rushing yards, and if he scores a rushing touchdown or 2. So I like Jalen Hurts here versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Okay, coming down in salary here, I like Tua Tagovailoa from the Miami Dolphins playing the Detroit Lions, who have the absolute worst defense overall. They give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Tua Tagovailoa has averaged 17.9 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets an average of 1.6 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 13% owned, projected at 19.7 fantasy points here in Week 8. He's 6,200 DraftKings salary, 1,500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51.5 points scored in this game, with the Dolphins favored by 3.5. Tua Tagovailoa, he came back from injury last week, scored 16 fantasy points, had 4 rush attempts. Now he's got a fantastic matchup in what should be a high-scoring game, in a close, competitive game within a field goal or so. So I like Tua Tagovailoa here versus the Detroit Lions. So another quarterback that I like is Kirk Cousins from the Minnesota Vikings, playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have the 8th worst defense overall. They give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Kirk Cousins has averaged 17.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 1.5 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 7% owned, projected at 18.6 fantasy points here in Week 8. He's 6,100 DraftKings salary, 1,700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Vikings favored by 3.5. Kirk Cousins has scored 17, 23, and 14 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He had 2, 4, and 0 rush attempts in those games. Now, he's got a great matchup here, and he's got good weapons with Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen. So I like Kirk Cousins here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Okay, now if you're looking to save a bunch of salary at the quarterback position, well, he's 400 less than Kirk Cousins, but it's got a heck of a lot more rushing upside, and he put up a pretty big game last week, and now he's got a good matchup. So take a look at Daniel Jones from the New York Giants playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have the third worst defense overall. They give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Daniel Jones has averaged 18 fantasy points per game on the season, and I like this pick because he's getting an average of 8.3 rush attempts per game. Going to be about 8% owned, projected at 17.9 fantasy points here in week 8, and he's $5,700 DraftKings salary, $1,800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Giants trailing by 3. So Daniel Jones has scored 32, 15, and 12 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 11, 6, and 10 rush attempts in those games. So I like Daniel Jones here versus the Seattle Seahawks. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So the studs on the slate that I like: Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley. Jonathan Taylor's in a good spot, although I like Henry and Barkley a little bit more. Dalvin Cook, he's got a tough matchup here. Not a terrible matchup. The Arizona Cardinals give up the 10th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs, so they're close to middle of the pack, give or take a handful. So Dalvin Cook, I like this pick because you can save a little bit of salary here. If you want to come off of Josh Jacobs, who's going to be chalk at 20% owned because he's just having a fantastic run. If you want to come off of Josh Jacobs, take a look at Dalvin Cook from the Minnesota Vikings playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have the 8th worst defense overall. They've been pretty good versus opposing running backs. Dalvin Cook has averaged 14.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 15.7 rush attempts per game and 2.7 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 8% owned, projected at 15.8 fantasy points here in week 8. He's $7,600 DraftKings salary, $600 more on FanDuel, and Dalvin Cook has scored 15, 26, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 13, 18, and 20 rush attempts on top of 1, 2, and 2 pass targets. Okay guys, it's time to announce the winner of our $25 weekly PayPal giveaway, and the winner is Daniel Arnett. Congratulations, Daniel Arnett. You are the winner of this week's $25 PayPal giveaway. Please reply to our comment to collect your prize.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
So this is my contrarian pick here. If you're not going to go with Derrick Henry or Saquon Barkley or Josh Jacobs or Jonathan Taylor, I think the contrarian pick here is Dalvin Cook, because people are going to be looking at that bad matchup, and his stats as a whole are much lower than those other guys. He's comparable with Jonathan Taylor in terms of fantasy points per game, but Jonathan Taylor is out touching Dalvin Cook by quite a bit, and so are the other guys. So Josh Jacobs is the stud and the chalk on the slate, although Saquon Barkley going to be about 22% owned over Josh Jacobs, who's going to be about 20% owned. So there's no clear-cut winner here at running back. You got Derrick Henry at 19%, Saquon Barkley at 22%, Jonathan Taylor at 8%, Dalvin Cook at 8%, Josh Jacobs at 20%, and Alvin Kamara at 18%. So sorry I've been all over the place, guys. All these running backs are in good spots, or at least are worth playing in some of your lineups here this week. So let me go over Alvin Kamara from the New Orleans Saints playing the Las Vegas Raiders, who have the 4th worst defense overall. They're middle of the pack defending opposing running backs. Alvin Kamara has averaged 15.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 15.4 rush attempts per game. But I like this pick because he gets an average of 7 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 18% owned, projected at 17.9 fantasy points here in week 8. He's 7,100 DraftKings salary, 700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49.5 points scored in this game, with the Saints trailing by 1.5. Now, Alvin Kamara has scored 18, and 27 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 11, 19, and 23 rush attempts, on top of 9, and 6 pass targets. So a ton of volume here. You're getting him at a discount in what should be a close game and a high scoring game and a pretty good matchup here. So I like Alvin Kamara here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, if you want to come down in salary, take a look at Miles Sanders from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have the 5th worst defense overall. They give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Miles Sanders has averaged 15.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 17.5 rush attempts per game and 2.2 pass targets per game. Now, I like this pick because he's only going to be about 5% owned. He's projected at 13.9 fantasy points here in week 8, but I think he can get his season average or more, so I think he's going to get at least 15 fantasy points here this week. And he is 6,600 DraftKings salary, 800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game, with the Eagles favored by 10.5. So this could turn into a running game script for Miles Sanders and the Philadelphia Eagles. And Miles Sanders has scored 14, 8, and 33 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 18, 15, and 27 rush attempts, on top of 1, 3, and 3 pass targets. So he's getting some pretty heavy volume here. You're going to get a discount with this pick. He's in a great matchup and the low ownership. So I like Miles Sanders here versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Okay, now coming down in salary just a little bit here, you got Kenneth Walker, Ramondre Stevenson, Raheem Mostert. So out of those guys, the guy that I think is in a fantastic spot here is Raheem Mostert from the Miami Dolphins playing the Detroit Lions, who have the absolute worst defense overall. They give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Raheem Mostert, he's averaged 10.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 12.4 rush attempts per game and 2.7 pass targets per game. But now his rush attempts and his pass targets and his production have all gone up now that he's the lead running back for the Miami Dolphins. He's going to be about 21% owned. He's projected at 13.8 fantasy points here in week 8. He's only 5,900 DraftKings salary, 900 more on FanDuel, and Raheem Mostert had scored 21, 6, and 22 fantasy points in the last 3 games, up a 16, 14, and 18 rush attempts, on top of 5, 2, and 3 pass targets. So some pretty decent volume over the past 3 weeks. Now he's got a fantastic matchup in a high-scoring game. So I like Raheem Mostert here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. So studs on the slate, you got Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, Davante Adams, who looks like he's questionable, was limited in practice, Tyreek Hill. So out of those guys, I really like Justin Jefferson from the Minnesota Vikings playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have the 8th worst defense overall. Now, they've been pretty good versus opposing wide receivers, but Justin Jefferson has averaged 24.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 10.5 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 97% of the snaps, going to be about 10% owned, projected at 23.7 fantasy points here in week 8. He's 9,100 DraftKings salary, 100 less on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Vikings favored by 3.5. Now, Justin Jefferson has scored 20, 33, and 34 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 8, 13, and 13 pass targets. So Justin Jefferson, I think, is a good stack with Adam Thielen and Kirk Cousins. And out of all the studs on the slate, he is my favorite wide receiver stud. So I like Justin Jefferson here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Okay, now another guy you got to consider, even though he's priced up here, is Tyreek Hill from the Miami Dolphins, because remember, Tua Tagovailoa is back in action. Although Tyreek Hill scored 14, 33, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 13, 15, and 7 pass targets. So he's getting a ton of volume, going to be about 20% owned, projected at 20.9 fantasy points here in week 8. He's 8,500 DraftKings salary, 200 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. 51.5 points scored in this game, with the Dolphins favored by 3.5. So I like Tyreek Hill here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, guys, now Deebo Samuel is out, and I liked this pick even before we got the news that Deebo Samuel was going to be out this week. So I like Brandon Ayuk from the San Francisco 49ers playing the LA Rams, who have a good defense overall, but they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Brandon Ayuk has averaged 13 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7 pass targets per game. Now, he's been on the field for 91% of the snaps. Now, I think this ownership is going to come up because that Deebo Samuel injury was just released not too long ago. But currently, Brandon Ayuk only going to be about 2% owned. They'll probably jump up to about 10% once people factor in the Deebo Samuel injury. But Brandon Ayuk is projected at 13.8 fantasy points here in week 8. I'm going to bump that up to 17 fantasy points. I think he exceeds his average. I think he gets a ton of pass targets in this game. And he's only 6,100 DraftKings salary, 600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 42 points scored in this game, with the 49ers favored by 1. So Brandon Ayuk has scored 15, 28, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 11, 11, and 4 pass targets. So 22 pass targets in the past 2 weeks. Now with Deebo Samuel out and a good wide receiver matchup, I like Brandon Ayuk here versus the LA Rams.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, so the injuries continue to plague the New Orleans Saints wide receivers. Jarvis Landry still out. Michael Thomas still out. So that's opening up a lot of pass targets for Chris Olave from the New Orleans Saints, playing the Las Vegas Raiders, who have the 4th worst defense overall. They give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Chris Olave has averaged 16.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9.3 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 16% owned, projected at 15.5 fantasy points here in week 8. He's 6,000 DraftKings salary, 900 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 49.5 points scored in this game, with the Saints trailing by 1.5. And Chris Olave scored 21 fantasy points last week off of 14 pass targets. So he's been getting a ton of volume. He's been super productive. His salary is still relatively low for his involvement in the game. And he's got a great matchup in what should be a high-scoring, close, competitive game. Lots to like about this pick. So I like Chris Olave here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Okay, now if you want to save even more salary here, take a look at DJ Moore from the Carolina Panthers playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 2nd worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. DJ Moore has averaged 10 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.7 pass targets per game, and he gets an average of 1 rush attempt per game as well. He's been on the field for 97% of the snaps. He's going to be about 22% owned, projected at 14.1 fantasy points here in week 8. He's only 5,300 DraftKings salary. He's 900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 41 points scored in this game, with the Carolina Panthers trailing by 4. So DJ Moore has scored 20, 4, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 10, 7, and 8 pass targets on top of 1, 0, and 1 rush attempt. So good volume, pretty good production 2 out of the past 3 weeks. With Christian McCaffrey off the team, it's going to open up more action for DJ Moore. Salary's still low. I know that ownership is up there, but for good reason. Fantastic matchup. So I like DJ Moore here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. So at the tight end position here, no super studs on the slate. The most expensive tight end on the slate is George Kittle from the San Francisco 49ers playing the LA Rams, who have a good defense overall. They've been good versus opposing tight ends. George Kittle has averaged 11.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.8 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 75% of the snaps, going to be about 4% owned, projected at 12.1 fantasy points here in week 8. He's 5,700 DraftKings salary, 1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 42 points scored in this game, with the 49ers favored by 1. So George Kittle has scored 22, 16, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 9, 10, and 6 pass targets. And remember, Deebo Samuel is going to be out. So this is another guy who should benefit from some extra pass targets. And then you got Christian McCaffrey opening up the backfield. I like the odds here for George Kittle and for Brandon Ayuk. I think there could be an opportunity for a Jimmy Garoppolo, George Kittle, Brandon Ayuk stack. So I like George Kittle here versus the LA Rams. Okay, another tight end that I like is Zach Ertz from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Zach Ertz has averaged 12.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.9 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 84% of the snaps, going to be about 5% owned, projected at 10.8 fantasy points. I'm going to bump that up to 13 fantasy points. I know he had a bad week last week, but I think he bounces back here. And he's 5,100 DraftKings salary, 900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Cardinals trailing by 3.5. Zach Ertz has scored 6, 14, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 4, 10, and 10 pass targets. So good matchup here, high scoring game. If he can get back on track towards 8 to 10 pass targets, I think he can have a fantastic week. So I like Zach Ertz here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Okay, another tight end that I like is Dallas Goedert from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have the 5th worst defense overall. They've been pretty good versus opposing tight ends, but Dallas Goedert has averaged 11.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.8 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 88% of the snaps, going to be about 9% owned, projected at 11.7 fantasy points here in week 8. He's 5,000 DraftKings salary, 900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game, with the Eagles favored by 10.5. So Dallas Goedert scored 4, 18, and 12 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 5, 9, and 6 pass targets. So he's had a good season with the exception of last week, where he only scored 4 fantasy points off of 5 pass targets. But I think he has a big bounce back week here. So I like Dallas Goedert here versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Okay, another tight end that I like is TJ Hawkinson from the Detroit Lions playing the Miami Dolphins, who have the 12th worst defense overall. They give up the 11th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. TJ Hawkinson has averaged 12.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.5 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 85% of the snaps, going to be about 7% owned, projected at 11.2 fantasy points here in week 8. He's 4,900 DraftKings salary, 1,400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51.5 points scored in this game, with the Lions trailing by 3.5. So TJ Hawkinson has scored 9, 2, and 43 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 5, 4, and 12 pass targets. So he's been pretty quiet the past 2 weeks. I think he makes some noise here this week in what should be a high-scoring game and a close, competitive game with a pretty decent matchup. So I like TJ Hawkinson here versus the Miami Dolphins.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite
player for this NFL slate.
I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.